And Tony comes to you with multiple credentials, including a long research history in this research around fractional mechanics that has led into combining his research interests with a passion for sustainability to think about what it looks like to actually extract fossil fuels regionally in this area. And so he has spent the last several years in his emeritus status giving talks all over the state and other states around us as an expert in this area and thinking critically about what our energy future might look like and what the environmental impacts of that energy future are. I will remind you all that Tony has actually been awarded multiple teaching awards, so we have a high expectation, despite his absence of caffeine, of delivering us a stimulating 50 minutes. It is my pleasure to welcome Tony to give the first of 3 talks.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, Todd. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming and allowing me to come out of hibernation briefly to present, as Todd pointed out, the first of 3 very tightly coupled seminars. So, as many of you know, most of you don't, School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and in fact my former home group within CEE, is currently trying to recruit a tenure track faculty member in sustainable underground energy systems. And among the areas of expertise that are being sought in that search is one in unconventional oil and gas development. So I thought it would be hopefully useful and informative to my colleagues on the faculty and the Cornell community at large to tell you what I know about unconventional oil and gas development. And that would be the title of this talk. But you'll notice that there are 2 pictures on that first slide that don't appear to have anything to do with unconventional oil and gas development. They do have everything to do with the next 2 lectures, talks, presentations. You're not required to attend, but I hope you do. And the reason why those other 2 are there is because of the word that Todd already mentioned, sustainability. I don't think we can talk rationally about unconventional oil and gas development without addressing the constraints on sustainability of such an activity. And those constraints are climate change and renewable energy generation as part of the ongoing worldwide energy transition. So today, I will focus exclusively on unconventional oil and gas development. And here are the topics. First thing I have to do is tell you what it is. What's an unconventional oil and gas resource? Why is it called unconventional? What's fracking all about? There are a lot of misconceptions out there that unconventional means fracking. How are unconventional resources developed? What does it take to get oil and gas out of an unconventional resource? What are the impacts of that development? Do those impacts have anything to do with our daily lives or our climate future or renewable energy? To be seen. What does the science say about those impacts? And finally, what does the development of an unconventional oil and gas resource on a global scale mean in the context, the larger context of its sustainability under the constraints of climate change and the energy transition? So those are the topics. Topic 1. Todd wanted this to be an exciting seminar. The worst thing to do at the beginning of a seminar is to define terms. But this is the official oil and gas definition of an unconventional resource, taken from the Schlumberger dictionary. Schlumberger is the largest oil and gas field service company in the world. I had the honor and privilege of working with them for many, many years. Great scientists and engineers, horrible PR people. So it's today, obviously something that's unconventional today will be conventional tomorrow, so there's a time element. But today, a resource, a rock mass, whose porosity and permeability make it an outlier compared to conventional resources, means it's unconventional. And in particular today, coal bed methane, not relevant to today's talk. Shale gas, very relevant to today's talk. Fractured reservoirs, very relevant to today's talk. And tight gas sands, very relevant to today's talk. So answer to the first question, what is an unconventional oil and gas resource? For the purposes of today, for example, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, with 12,000 unconventional oil and gas wells, all of them gas, defines unconventional as coming from shale. Got it? Answer the first question. Some hydrocarbon reservoirs, tight sands, coal bed methane, carbonate reservoirs, shale, some of them have extremely low permeability of the rock itself. Piece of shale from my front yard. The permeability of this piece of rock is about the same as the permeability of aluminum. I'll let that sink in for a minute. What's in it doesn't want to come out of it very easily. And to get something to go through it is very, very difficult. All right, so how do you get oil or gas that, for example, is trapped in micron-sized pore spaces in this rock to come out of it? You stimulate it. That's another official oil and gas term, stimulation, like I'm doing to you right now, hopefully. There are various types of stimulation. Again, these are official definitions. I learned about them in the 1970s before most of you were born. Acid injection. You can pump acid down a well and etch wormholes in the rock, and by doing so you create an enhanced surface area. The more surface area you have, the higher the probability that you're going to get an increase in effective permeability of the rock mass. Explosive breakage. The first kinds of stimulation were done in the early 1800s in western New York State by dropping nitroglycerin down a well. Boom. Shock. Shock fracture the rock. You fracture the rock, you increase surface area, you increase flow paths, increase effective permeability. Water flooding. That happened next. People noticed sometimes when you had a deep well and you filled it full of water, the pressure at the bottom of the well was sufficient to fracture the rock. That was the antecedent to what happened about the same year I was born, 1998. No, 1947. Commercial hydraulic fracturing came into existence, same year I was born. If you pump a liquid or a gas down a well at sufficiently high pressure to overcome hydrostatic stress, vertical and horizontal, and overcome the strength of the rock, you can fracture the rock and enhance the permeability. That's called fracking. Or if you already have a fractured rock mass and you don't need to fracture it, you can open wider or extend existing fractures, and that's called hydraulic stimulation. The great irony of the last 15 years of endless banter from the White House to the Ithaca Journal is this business about fracking, which actually has nothing to do with shale. That's ironic, isn't it? Let me tell you what I mean. What is fracking? What's it all about? This is the most often used slide I've ever seen in the last 15 years. It was created by the Energy Information Agency of the U.S. Department of Energy. It attempts to show the differences among some kinds of conventional oil and gas development and some unconventional oil and gas development. Let me spend a minute explaining it to you. If the oil and gas which is created in shale, shale is the source rock for all oil and gas, Tommy Gold notwithstanding, and nobody in the audience will understand that except Tom O'Rourke. Shale is the origin of oil and gas. It's the source rock. If over eons, 500 million years or so, the oil and gas can get out of the shale and migrate, but become trapped by some sort of seal rock, it creates a pool of gas. And if you drill a well vertically down into that pool of gas and happen to hit it, that's an unconventional gas resource. No stimulation needed. If you don't hit it, you get a dry hole. Or the gas might be associated with oil. You drill into a pool of oil which has been trapped by a seal, and above it there might be some gas or mixed with it with gas. Again, that's a conventional resource. You don't need to frack it. No stimulation needed. On the other hand, if we're talking about unconventional oil or gas from shale, here's your gas and oil-rich shale layer. You drill down and then you drill along the shale and you stimulate it. But you don't need to frack it, as you'll see. And then there's this possibility of above the shale there is a sandstone whose permeability is 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than the permeability of the shale. And gas and oil have migrated out of the shale, have become trapped in the very large pore spaces of the sandstone, which is very permeable. And so you can frack that and increase the permeability even more. So let's go back to when I was a kid, and I was working for a company called Schlumberger, working with them, not for them. And we set up a set of experiments out in Salt Lake City. And we took a meter cube of sandstone. Notice it's homogeneous, it's anisotropic, but it's not fractured at that scale. And we drilled it just like you would drill a well. And we cased that well, and we cemented the well, and we perforated the well, sorry about the jargon, and then we fracked it. And split that rock in half, and here is the steel casing, here this pink purple stuff is the cement, here is a perforation, here is a perforation. You put a highly pressurized, in this case pink dyed fluid through those perforations, and that fluid pressure creates a hydraulic fracture. I spent 30 years working on that problem, and it turned out to be trivial compared to this one. Anybody recognize that site or that person? Where is that? Nope. Nope, close. Route 13 interchange, Cayuga Heights Road and Route 13. That is an exposed shale mass. Notice the difference between that and the sandstone at the same scale? Say yes. All right, don't say yes. This is a naturally hydraulically fractured rock mass. Every one of those discontinuities has either been created, extended, or widened by natural gas pressure. Put it all together. Start connecting the dots. Shale is the source of all oil and gas. What happens if the gas can't get out of the shale? But the pressure in the gas reaches so high that it starts to fracture the shale. So here's a typical joint. That's a fracture from gas. All these bedding planes, which are natural because of sedimentary action of the shale, have been extended and widened by gas pressure. But at the same scale, the sandstone, why would we frack that when it's already fracked? We only have to hydraulically stimulate it. Okay, so there's the same shale exposure. Step back a little bit. I'm going to show you how the industry, the oil and gas service industry, the Halliburtons and Schlumbergers, advertise their services. So I'm going to take a picture advertisement from this magazine and superimpose it on that so that you understand what fracking is not about. So there's the advertisement. Here is the horizontal segment of the well. Notice what they've done to all those bedding planes and joints. Filled them with fluid, not necessarily gold-plated, and widened them. Didn't need to fracture the rock. There's very little new fracturing occurring in a hydraulic stimulation of a shale oil or shale gas well. You're only hydraulically stimulating it by creating a flow network among all the existing uncountable number of existing natural discontinuities. This is now not a fracture mechanics problem, which is why it's damn difficult for somebody who, like me, and I only know fracture mechanics, I don't know statistical mechanics. That's what this is. Try to predict whether the fluid coming out of that perforation is going to wind up over here or over here. That's like saying I'm on 49th and 7th in Manhattan. Can I get to Brooklyn from there? Yeah. Get the analogy? Did you all have your coffee today? So that's how the industry looks at hydraulic stimulation in a shale mess. Just create a flow network among all the discontinuities already there. Create a fluid intrusion of sufficiently high pressure to be overcome overburden stress, horizontal stresses, widen all the existing discontinuities, prop them open with sand particles so that when you relieve the fluid pressure which has done that, things don't just slam shut on you. They slam shut on sand particles, which leaves a sub-millimeter width of discontinuity. To a methane molecule, a sub-millimeter width is infinity wide. You don't need very much to get methane out, or even oil. Got it? All right, so that's why fracking is irrelevant. Hydraulic stimulation is very relevant, and that's the difference between stimulating a conventional resource or not and having to stimulate an unconventional source. So let's suppose we're going to go about and do that. It's 2002, we're in Texas, and we got this thing called the Barnett Shale, and one guy running a 10-person oil and gas company took all the research that was paid for by we taxpayers back in the early 80s and paid me for my first sabbatical at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 1984 and 1985 to try to figure out how to stimulate shale, how to actually do it. What kind of fluid, what kind of pressure, what kind of proppant, what kind of well, what kind of machinery, what kind of chemicals. Tremendous American inventiveness in the 1990s. To figure that all out. And here it is in a nutshell. And I hope you notice that every slide I'm showing you, I give you the source. And most of the slides I'm going to show you, I get from the industry, or from my own research, or from government research, but certainly from peer-reviewed research. I've been using this slide for about 10 years. It was first put together by Chesapeake and Statoil, very large gas and oil companies. And I amended it a bit. So let me explain it because it tells you everything you know about how you develop an unconventional shale resource. This gray box down here is a layer of shale. It's like that exposure at Route 13 and Cayuga Heights Road. It has a finite thickness. It has a very large areal extent, tens of thousands of square miles, for example, in the case of the Marcellus or the Barnett. Here's the surface, pictured here very idyllically. And on the surface, you create things that are called pads. The pad is the area on the surface where you're going to drill and stimulate and produce. And from each pad, you drill not one well vertically, but you drill multiple wells subvertically and then laterally. Because what you want is to expose your well to as much of the shale as possible. Just dipping the toe of a well into it isn't going to do it, because there's no big pool down there. The pools in shale are submicron sized. So you have to have your well travel for thousands of feet, in some cases multiple miles, along a lateral. Now, since there is oil or gas everywhere in the shale, the corporate business model is to drill everywhere. Why would you want to leave a resource untapped? When you had a pool, you drilled into the pool, developed it. When the pool went dry, you found another pool. It's different with shale. If the shale is of sufficient age, sufficient organic content, sufficient depth, sufficient pressure, sufficient thickness, it's economically developable, and it only makes your bottom line look good if you get almost all of it out, which means you've got to drill almost everywhere. So there you have it. Shale gas and oil production must use clustered, ideally a uniform array of pads, multi-well. It's not economically to just drill one well from a pad. High volume, I'll tell you what I mean by that, but high volume hydraulic stimulation and very long laterals. So the drawing is not the scale, but the dimensions are indicative of what's actually happening. You got that picture? Let's put it into practice. Let's show you what it really looks like. The idyllic looking pad in the cartoon I just showed you doesn't reflect reality. This is typically the kind of earth movement and excavation that has to occur in places like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Colorado, not Texas, in order to create a pad. Kill 100,000 trees. That's habitat destruction. More importantly, it's killing carbon capture and sequestration units at the same time you're trying to uncapture carbon. Then you got to drill after you created the pad. So here's an example of 2 drill rigs operating simultaneously on what will be a 20-well pad. This is the drilling process. Notice a lot of heavy machinery. We'll talk more about its impacts in a few minutes. You drilled the well, now you have to stimulate it. So here's a typical stimulation view. This is a 12-well pad. 10-well pad. I can tell that because there are 5 separators, 10 condensate tanks. This is during the hydraulic stimulation phase. Create a small lake because you're going to need 10 to 20 million gallons of water. Let that sink in for a minute. 10 to 20 million gallons of water. You're going to need 20,000 horsepower of pumping capacity. Each one of those trucks is 1,200 horsepower diesel. You're going to need sand, mined in Wisconsin, transported by unit trains around the country, then put on 25-ton trucks and transported by truck to the site. You're going to need fracking chemicals. You don't just inject water. It's slick water with a bunch of other things in it. And you spend a week or so stimulating the well. You move to the next well, you stimulate that one, move to the next well, stimulate that one. So build a pad, drill the wells, stimulate the wells. Industry learns. Apart from the people I worked with here at Cornell, the smartest people I ever worked with in the world are the people working in the oil and gas industry. They're almost as smart as you all, not quite. And when I started working with them back in the 80s, there was no such thing as an unconventional gas well. But by the time we got to this century, this was the first formula that worked. First generation, pre-2015, roughly 2002 to 2012. The lateral could be up to a mile long. And to prop open all those pre-existing discontinuities, they would inject about 500 pounds of sand for every foot of lateral. So 5,000 feet, 500 pounds times 5,000 feet, that's the amount of sand that had to get mined in Wisconsin and transported. The industry began to figure out, hey, wait a minute, let's upscale. Let's go to longer laterals. So by around 2017, we were into the what the industry calls second gen wells. Those wells would be 1.5 miles long, and they'd be using 3/4 of a ton of sand for every 1 foot. I'll talk about how much water in a minute. Fast forward to today, all the wells that are being drilled, all the unconventional wells, oil and gas that are being drilled and stimulated today, almost without exception, are 3rd gen wells. The lateral is at least 2 miles long, in some cases 4 miles long. And sand is now up to over a ton per foot. You do the math. 2,500 pounds per foot, 25,000 feet. Basically, we're moving Wisconsin to the underground of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Colorado, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. I don't think the people from Wisconsin, I think they'd rather be talking about cheese than sand, but anyway. All right, here's an example. The state of the art 5 years ago, 2nd gen well, leading edge, northeastern British Columbia, Horn River. 16 wells on that pad. Obviously, this is about 25 acres of habitat change. 1.8 billion liters of water, 78,000 tons of sand, 25 million liters of chemicals, 3-kilometer laterals, 40,000 horsepower diesel pumps. That's what's happening in Pennsylvania now. So for those of you who drive upstate New York and you look out in the fields and you see wellheads, and you say, oh man, New York's producing gas. Look at that, there's a wellhead. You never saw something like that in New York. And as long as I'm alive, you never will. But it's happening in Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and Colorado, and Texas, and okay. So what are the impacts? Can't talk about all of them, don't have time. But the key here is to recognize that once you start talking shale, you must be talking scale, upscale. Think times 10 times 100. 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more, greater, deeper, longer than conventional. So there are currently 837,334 producing oil and gas wells in the continental United States, including Alaska, including offshore. That's of yesterday. Only about 60,000 of those are unconventional. And yet those 60,000 unconventional wells have caused a revolution. The U.S. went from being a net importer of natural gas to now an exporter of natural gas. We went from producing 8 million barrels of crude oil per day to producing 14 million barrels of crude oil per day, and that's all because of those 60,000 wells. You don't get something for nothing. You can't get that huge increase in productivity without something being different, and that something is scale. So let me emphasize that. I call these technologies of scale. All of the technologies involved in developing unconventional oil and gas from shale are upscale. The pads are larger, I showed you that, and you need more of them. That means more habitat destruction. By that I mean trees. The drill rigs are larger. All the wells drilled in the state of New York, 44,000 some wells that were ever drilled in the entire history of the state of New York, use ones, smallest drill rig, 50 feet tall. To drill a shale gas or oil well, you need threes, 175 feet tall. More diesel horsepower, more emissions, more noise. Larger fracking equipment, higher pressure, higher fluid volume, more diesel horsepower. I'll expand on some of these over the next few slides. Be patient. That means you need more water, more proppant, more chemicals, and more emissions. Higher volume of flowback. All that hydraulic stimulation fluid that you pump down, most of it comes back up. What went down as water with additives comes back as a waste stream. You put 20 million gallons down, 15 million gallons come back that you have to dispose of. And you've taken 15 millions of gallons, actually you've taken all 20 million gallons out of the hydrologic cycle. It's consumptive use. Larger and longer flaring, more emissions, noise, and light pollution, more truck traffic. How do you get 2,500 pounds of sand into a 20,000 foot lateral without transporting all that sand by truck to the site? Wear and tear on highways, increased accidents, more diesel pollution. More pipeline mollies, more habitat destruction, more accidents with pipelines. More and larger compressor stations. Who lives in Ellis Hollow? Are you all from here? There's a compressor station out in Ellis Hollow. It wasn't built specifically for unconventional oil and gas, but as I'll show you in a video in a few minutes, it experiences the same sorts of upsets that occur in compressor stations. More noise and more emissions, more gas migration, higher emissions, more water pollution, and exacerbation of climate change, but that's for the next talk. So let me expand on some of these. No time to go into each one. Larger pads, more wells. This is a bar chart that shows, as of a week ago, the average number of wells on the pads in Pennsylvania by county. These are all the counties experiencing shale gas development in Pennsylvania. This is the average number of wells per pad. In 2004, when this started in Pennsylvania, everything was one. There was one well on a pad, but the pads were sized for more wells. And so as time goes on, operators come back and drill more and more wells. So there are currently 8,700, 8,800 producing shale gas wells in the state of Pennsylvania. There are 11,000 drilled. Current Prognostications by the U.S. Government Department of Energy says there will be 40 to 60,000 of those wells in Pennsylvania. So that number is going to go up to about 15 on average. Last week I pulled a permit from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection because I had heard that a super pad was going to be built in southwestern Pennsylvania with 44 wells on one pad. How would you like to live 500 feet from that pad? Yes, Jerry?
Make a fortune.
You would make a fortune?
Yeah, sure. I sold the rights.
You'd
I
what?
sold the rights to put that pad on my land. I'm going to make out like crazy to live in New York City.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate that. Okay, this is one of the wells. Here's the layout of those 44 wells. The longest one has a 2.9 mile lateral and will use 3,000 pounds of sand per foot. The current record in Pennsylvania is only 39 wells. Water consumption. It's a graph. I know you can't read the numbers, so let me tell you. This is 2010. The average length of a lateral in 2010 was about 5,000 feet, as I told you. That was a Gen 1 well. Here's 2018. Average length is 12,000 feet. And this is in millions of gallons water consumed. Forget about the blue dots. Those are injection waste wells. All the gold dots and the gold lines say that between 2010 and 2018, we went from an average of 5,000 foot lateral to an average of 12,000 foot lateral. We went from an average of 4 million gallons to about 18 million gallons of water per well. By the way, this sort of statistic holds whether you're in Texas or Pennsylvania. So let's talk about Texas for a minute. This whole business started with the Barnett Shale, just west and south of Dallas, where there are now 19,000 shale gas wells. What's happening now is they moved west for oil. Barnett was gas. The Permian Basin, which is West Texas, southeastern New Mexico, is now being redeveloped. It's what created the University of Texas educational system. But it's now being redeveloped because it's basically a shale resource, and they're now using all the technology that's been developed to go back there and redevelop it. That's a typical well, 25 million gallons in the Permian. Anybody been to West Texas and southeastern New Mexico recently? What do they not have a lot of? So if you're a rancher, Jerry, and you're living in southwest Texas, are you still going to be raising cattle, or are you going to sell your water? Thank you.
It's a lot easier.
And it's consumptive use. Pipelines. Everybody knows that there are thousands and thousands of miles of pipelines, transmission pipelines, distribution pipelines, pipelines all over the place. And everybody knows that the older the pipelines get, the more risky they become and more prone to accidents, right? No. This is a bar chart that shows by decade in which the pipeline was installed, the number of accidents in that pipeline per year, per 10,000 miles of pipeline. Every year, take 10,000 miles of pipeline, normalize it, figure out how many accidents. The most modern pipelines have the most accidents. Counterintuitive? Not really. Why not? But modern pipelines are made with modern materials. Fracture toughness, I know about that. Tom and Harry and I did a lot of work on gas transmission pipelines. We know about strength and toughness and stress and strain. Why is it that modern pipelines have a higher rate of incidence of accidents? Deregulation.
Higher pressure.
Higher pressure. Who the hell cares?
Startup problems.
Build them quick. Okay, I'm going to show you some videos. We're getting towards the end here, and I want to start transitioning to what I hope you will see in the next presentation, which is the impact that I haven't mentioned yet on climate change. I've already talked about trees being carbon capture and sequestration units. So I'm going to show a series of videos over the next couple slides. This one is a video I took down in a holla in West Virginia last spring. Driving down the road, visiting families who had lost their water. Yeah, the water well went bad. They don't have any water. Their properties have no intrinsic value. They don't pay property taxes because they don't have any intrinsic value. They're just shacks in the hollow. There's a lot of social injustice in the world, and a lot of that social injustice is coming from the stuff I'm talking about. So this is a video I took of a pipeline construction activity. I'll let it speak for itself. What'd you see? Tell me what you saw. I'm not going to say another word until you start talking to me. What did you see?
Fire.
What were they doing with the trees? They're burning them. Why didn't the company donate the firewood to the people in the hollow? Why did they burn the trees? Why didn't they process them for wood products? Because it's cheaper. What does burning the trees do? Creates black carbon in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It is the antithesis of what the tree is supposed to do. You not only kill the tree, you burn the damn tree. So there's a process, as I said before, you're taking that which Mother Nature provides as a natural buffer against carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you're using it to create more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Another impact is the invasiveness and spatial intensity necessary to economically develop unconventional resources. Remember the idea of clustered pads? Ideally, if every landowner, Jerry, if every landowner agreed that there would be no interference, the oil and gas companies could go anywhere they want to put their pads anywhere they want, they would have, here's Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, here's Bradford County, here's New York up here, this is heaven, this is hell. Every one of those yellow dots is a pad. Not uniformly distributed because there are some restrictions. I mean, you can't drill in a school playground, but you can drill 500 feet away. In Pennsylvania, you can drill in a residential zone. In every state in the Union, except for New York State, you can drill in a residential zone. New York did not ban fracking. New York currently has a administrative moratorium on high-volume hydraulic stimulation. If you want to frack a well, if you want to frack a limestone well, in New York, you can get a permit to do that. You just can't develop shale because it requires more than 200,000 gallons of frack fluid, which is the legal limit in New York. But New York is the only state where a lawsuit went all the way up to the State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York State. And it upheld zoning in New York State as a proper control of individual municipalities on what could happen in their zones. If you have a residential zone, it's for living. If you have an industrial zone, it's for industry. Not true in every other state in the country. So they can drill anywhere they want as long as they get landowner permission. Here's a specific incidence of what happened in the now famous Dimmock, Pennsylvania invasion. So in 2006 to 2008, one company created 41 pads. Every one of those red squares is a pad. 41 pads in 9 square miles. That's this area in the red box. 41 pads in 9 square miles in 18 months. And then the process ruined the water supply for 20 families. I know you can't see it from there, but there are some of these blue dots. Each blue dot is a water well. Everybody down there is on a water well. There's no municipal water. And every blue dot surrounded by a gold line, a gold circle, is a water well that was ruined. Why did that happen? Didn't happen in Texas. This is 2006, 2008. They were doing this 6 or 7 years before that in Texas. Hardly any water wells got ruined. Is there a difference between shale gas in northeastern Pennsylvania and shale gas in Dallas? Any geologists in the room? Any geologists in the room? Okay, so nobody from Earth and Atmospheric Sciences came to the seminar. Good. Okay, what does the science say about these impacts? Notice I only talked about some of the impacts. There are others that I don't have time to talk about. Talk about them in the next 2 seminars, some of them. What does the science say? This is a bar chart that shows the number of peer-reviewed publications that were produced in each year from 2009 to 2018 on the topic of impacts of shale, oil and gas, or tight oil and gas, meaning from sandstone. So by 2009, we were 5 to 6 years into the shale gas revolution. And by then, there had been 7 peer-reviewed publications. Almost doubled it. The next year, there were 6 more. And then, exponential, up until about 2016, and now hovering around 300 new peer-reviewed publications per year. What are these publications looking at? What are the impacts? I talked about some of them, so let me be more specific, but that's the history. We were 5 years into the revolution and we knew nothing. The industry knew a lot and they were learning more and more at every well. But the scientific community, the public, the regulators, and the legislators knew jack blank. 5 years later, we knew a little bit more. Now we know a lot. It's putting the cart before the horse. I thought you were supposed, before you jump into, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. So think first. Let's think this through. Is that a right thing? Should we elongate the fossil fuel era, starting in 2004, when we were beginning to get a very strange notion about climate change? More on that in the next talk. So 4 years ago, my colleagues and I, who had formed a not-for-profit company called Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. Any physicians in the room? Any scientists in the room? Any engineers in the room? So physicians, scientists, and engineers for healthy energy, and we took on a bunch of tasks, and one was to create an archive of all the peer-reviewed literature so that people, individuals, regulators, legislators, presidents, premiers, all the stakeholders could have access, ready access to the literature. No one had done that. So some of you heard a talk here last fall by Ken Arnold, and he talked about an archive in Texas. It just focused on Texas. It was an archive put together by the oil and gas industry. I guarantee you that we have papers in this archive that weren't in that archive. So every morning at 6 o'clock, automated routines are run on our computers that search all the primary databases in the world, all the science databases, all the medical databases, all the climate databases, all the atmospheric databases, all the political and legal databases for papers with keywords associated with unconventional oil and gas development and tight oil and gas development, and we post them. There it is, if you want to find them all. As of 2 days ago, there were 1,695 peer-reviewed publications in the archive. If we have the legal right to store them, then you can download them. If we don't have the legal right to store them, then we point to where you can get them. What are the impact areas? 12 different areas. I'll read them off. Air quality, climate, community, ecology, economics, general health, infrastructure, regulation, seismicity, waste fluids, water quality, and water usage. So every one of those 1,695 papers is in one or more of those categories. So if you're particularly concerned about one particular impact and you want to know what the scientific literature has to say about it, there you go. Free of charge. What does the scientific literature say about some of these things? Maybe all these papers are saying, go for it, this is great. So in a certainly not completely, totally, scientifically, statistically, objectively pure method, some of my colleagues decided in 2016, when this archive was 2 years old and had about 800 papers in it, to read all those 800 papers and make a decision. Does this paper, for example, in the area of human health impacts, conclude that there is no indication of significant public health risk or actual adverse health outcome? In 14% of the papers, that was the conclusion. In 86% of the papers, that was not the conclusion. Air quality. Can the development of unconventional oil and gas in your neighborhood, in your state, improve air quality? 0 papers. But 17% of them said we haven't detected, using the scientific methods that we have, any particularly bad impact. 83% said, yeah, measurable. Water quality. 34% said no measurable impact on water quality. 66% says measurable impact, negative, bad impact on water quality. No paper ever published said having an oil or gas well from shale in your neighborhood will improve your water. Although there are people in Pennsylvania who claim that it does, because if you have a private water well in Pennsylvania, you don't need a license to have one, you don't need a permit to have one. And by the way, if the oil and gas company comes and tests your water and finds out it's full of E. coli that you didn't know about, they've improved your water. All right, we're at the end. So I need to help you, for those of you who want to come back, prepare to participate in the next lecture, which is what is the impact on unconventional oil and gas on climate change? Because you can't talk about sustainability of unconventional oil and gas without talking about climate change. You can't do that. Nor can you talk about unconventional oil and gas without talking about renewable energy, which is also related to climate change. That's the nexus. Those 3 things are the nexus of your scientific lives or curiosity or research. So I'll conclude with a few more videos. So some of you know that back in 2011, I was a co-author on a paper that caused severe consternation. There were days when my wife did not want me in the house. From the White House all the way down to the Ithaca Journal, we were pilloried for saying something that was anathema. When you drill shale for oil and gas, there is so much methane emitted during the entire life cycle of building the pad, drilling the well, fracking the well, dehumidifying the gas, compressing the gas, transporting the gas, storing the gas, and using the gas. There's so much methane that leaks from that entire system that it makes the notion of natural gas being clean absurd. That's what we said. And the 3 of us who wrote that paper have, well, we certainly benefited from it. It has 11,000 citations. But we've also reaped the whirlwind of abuse and pillory. So when we published that paper, some of my colleagues here at Cornell said the paper was so crazy that it said things like, in our paper, we said there are very large, purposeful releases of methane associated with unconventional oil and gas development. Very large, purposeful emissions. And we were told that's impossible because that's unsafe. The industry would never do that. That's an emergency blowdown at a compressor station in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. I was there when that happened. I asked anybody who lived in Ellis Hollow. We have a Borger compressor station, and you know that there are purposeful and accidental blowdowns. That's methane. Well, it's at least 99% methane because it's northeastern shale gas, northeastern Pennsylvania shale gas. I thought methane was colorless. How can you see it? Thank you. The next video was sent to me by a colleague. Anybody have an idea what that is? Other than methane, large purposeful release, 2 pipelines undergoing repair. So if you have a 42-inch diameter, 1,000 psi natural gas pipeline that needs to be repaired, and it's 10 miles between block valves, what do you do with the 10 miles of gas that's in there? Poof. Anybody know what a pig is? Tom, tell them what a pig is.
It's a device that goes down pipelines and measures a variety of different.
A pipeline interrogation gizmo. So there's federal law that says if you got a transmission pipeline, you got to send a pig down that pipeline periodically to detect corrosion, cracks, dents. And so every time you pig a pipeline, you got to evacuate the gas. I took this video. Bradford County, Pennsylvania, spring of 2016.
There's the wellhead over here.
I mentioned that there are about 8,300 producing shale gas wells in Pennsylvania, about 11,000 drilled. Most of those have been hydraulically stimulated, but they don't have adequate pipeline in place to transport the gas. So in this case, the well had been drilled and hydraulically stimulated, and periodically it overpressurizes, so they depressurize it. So I'm standing there, and this white pickup truck shows up, and the guy gets out. He's actually standing right about here, walked up and opened the valve and turned around and walked away. What's so unsafe about that? The last video doesn't have any sound, so I'll show it again, I think. Forward-looking infrared, FLIR. Methane is colorless. Now, if it's coming into the atmosphere at very high pressure, condenses humidity in the atmosphere, and you can see it. But in many cases, you can't, because it's just pure methane. In this case, coming out of a condensate tank. This is a tank farm on a pad in Texas. That's not water vapor, that's methane. You can tune forward-looking infrared to pick up the signal of any hydrocarbon. In this case, they asked for the signal of methane. And so what you're seeing is continuous release, not one time, not for 1 hour, not for 1 day, but continuous release from the exhaust vents on condensate tanks. Happens in tens of thousands of condensate tanks all over the country, continuously, every day. My point, there's a lot of methane out there. And if you want to hear about how much and what it's doing to exacerbate climate change, I invite you to come to the next talk. So in that talk, I will try to connect the notion that the development of unconventional oil and gas came at the worst possible time to the growing science around climate change. So to summarize what I said today, finally, fracking does not mean unconventional. Shale means unconventional. Abuse you of that notion. Fracking is as old as I am. It's not new. Shale is new. Shale means scale. This is heavy industrial activity. Shale means intensity, invasive and spatial intensity. Scale and intensity imply more and different health and environmental impacts than conventional. We are just learning in the scientific literature what those impacts are after we've already opened the barn door for over a decade. And the most important impacts, since they affect every one of us, are on climate change and the ongoing global energy transition. So I will emphasize why, in the next talk, this shale revolution could not have come at a worse time. So I'll end there, and hopefully anybody wants to stick around for questions, I'll try to answer them.
Can you mention the dates of the next two seminars?
I could if I knew them.
February 27th
February 27th is the next one.
and March.
March 27th is the third and final one. So I hope to see as many of you as care to listen to what I had to say there, and we can continue to engage. In the meantime, any questions at this point? Have fun. Oh, yes.
Yeah, so what's in the injection water that is contaminating the wells? Is there like a chemical analysis that's done to understand what, or even what's the purpose of the chemicals in the injection water, and then are they sort of tracing it in some sense?
Yes. So the question is, what goes down during a hydraulic stimulation in addition to water? At least 4 different chemicals are absolutely necessary. One is a friction reducer, a lubricant, because water against steel over 3 miles at 10,000 psi in a 4-inch diameter pipe, there's a lot of frictional loss. So you slicken the water, hence the term slick water is associated with shale gas. So you got to have a lubricant. You got to have an anti-corrosive, because what's down there is brine, or what will be brine when mixed with the water you're sending down there, that's 100 times more salty than seawater, and your casing is steel. So you want an anti-corrosive, like what you put in the radiator of your car. You need a bactericide, something that kills bacteria, because you're injecting impure water into an impure source, which is also full of bacteria. There is life down there, folks. And that bacteria can convert some of the chemicals into hydrogen sulfide, which is really bad, or the bacteria can grow and clog your well. Not good. And you also need a scale inhibitor. By here, I mean, by scale, I don't mean big. I mean the kind of scale that you see on the bathtub walls and your tub walls, mineral deposits. So mineral deposits can also clog a well. So those 4 things are absolutely necessary. Depending upon the geology, the rock, the operator, the regulator, other kind of chemicals can also be used. pH adjusters, for example, lots of other chemicals. There's 600 or 700 chemicals on the market from which to select, but typically a hydraulic stimulation has 4 or 5 in them. Now, once that stuff goes down, the percentage of it that comes back up has residuals of those chemicals, plus whatever minerals and chemicals that were down there, the whole hydrocarbon suite, everything from methane to oil, including the BTEC suite, heavy metals, salts. So if what comes back up finds its way into the water supply, either because it has migrated from the well itself or it has been spilled on the surface, then you have a potential for water impact. You get that? Thanks for the question. Yes?
Have they done a way to reuse this water? Or
Yes.
treat it once they pump it out?
Yes. It's called recycling. There you go. So very soon after this revolution began, the industry realized it had a waste disposal problem. I'll show you some of the numbers in a minute, but basically trillions of gallons of liquid waste, and what do you do with it? So one thing that you do is treat it so it can be reused. It's called recycling. And this is a plot that shows for every county in Pennsylvania how much of the return fluid, called flowback, is being recycled, that's blue, and how much is not being recycled, that's green. So in some counties, you're actually recycling more than they're using. And in other counties, they're not recycling at all. Recycling costs money. It's off the bottom line. You don't put recycled fluid into a pipeline and send it to a customer. You don't sell it abroad. So recycling is expensive. Not all operators do it. Some operators have never done it, will never do it. Some of the larger, more socially conscious operators do it all the time. What was the second part of that question? Oh, okay. Oh, well, there is a second part. If you don't recycle it, what do you do with it? Injection wells. So an injection well is a waste well, typically a disused oil or gas well, which has exhausted its supply of oil and gas, means there's plenty of porosity down there. So you inject the waste fluid down a well. You put it back underground. And that's where most of it goes in most states. It's where most of it goes in Pennsylvania.
So it's lost for future use.
it's lost for future use. It's the other part of the consumptive. If you don't recycle, everything is consumptive. Yes?
So if cost was not an issue, could it be done without all of the releases and things like that? I mean, the thing, the thing about Pennsylvania, you sort of rush into it, we have $3 gas, you can't do anything properly with those sorts of prices. Cornell likes it, but but if it was the price when we had the hurricane, Katrina, was $15 gas. I mean, if I had $15 gas and we really limited, could I do it without all those emissions?
I love that question. So under what circumstances would it be good for the U.S. to continue to enlarge its unconventional oil and gas portfolio? And my answer is stop climate change. If you don't stop climate change, it'll never be good, because the primary driver of climate change right now is the primary driver behind carbon dioxide and methane emissions in climate change is unconventional oil and gas on a global scale. But I agree with you, if the prices were different, operators would take different decisions. Here's what would happen. For example, if the price of gas goes from $2.50 to $3, what are we paying at Cornell? $1 right now for 1,000 cubic feet? 2? Almost 3. Okay, if the price doubles, coal starts looking a lot better for electricity generation again, because one of the things that killed coal was not Obama. The thing that killed coal was low natural gas prices. What would happen to investment in renewable energy if gas prices went up? Renewable energy investment would go up. What would happen if gas prices went up? People would have to pay more to heat their houses unless they decided not to heat their houses with gas. This is complex. Everything's coupled. So, but great question. And we'll talk, I will attempt to try to connect some of those dots in the next 2 talks, because we got to talk about renewable energy impact on renewable energy of changing the pricing structure. Anything else? Yes?
When you recycle that water, aren't you left with some kind of sludge that you still have to deal with?
You sure are. All right, almost too late to tell this story, but it's 2012, and I heard that there was a recycling facility opening up in downtown Williamsport. So I and 6 of my friends decided to get in my car, and we drove down to Williamsport. We were invited by the president of the company to come and visit his state-of-the-art facility. Anybody know Williamsport? You know where the Wegmans is in Williamsport? You know where the recycling facility was? Adjacent to Wegmans. So 8,000-gallon tanker trucks were pulling in, opened the valve on the back, out comes 8,000 gallons of this stuff into a big open vat. I'm standing there looking at it, and there's the parking lot for Wegmans. And then we were invited inside to watch the process of recycling. And the end process is water that you could almost drink, that was just dumped into the Susquehanna at that point, and sludge. And we can imagine what's in the sludge. Okay, and that sludge then gets loaded onto trucks and taken to a landfill, where hopefully the leaching from the landfill is controlled. And on the way home, all 7 of us vomited on the side of the road. The aroma of the place, the gaseous emissions were such that we were, within a half hour, we were all sick. The way it works. Anything else? Again, thank you. Enjoy lunch, enjoy school.